Good morning, and thank you for joining our discussion on the impact that COVID has had on our local economy and frankly continues to have on the local economy. Um, I'm Ray Biggs, President and CEO of West Shore Bank. Thanks for joining us this morning. I'd like to introduce our guest panelists today. First is Matt McCauley. Matt is the CEO of Networks Northwest, who facilitates and manages various programs and services for 10 counties in Northwest Michigan. Matt is a proven connector and innovator who sees economic development as a three-legged stool: business, talent, and certainly community. And next, our economic expert today is Charlie McQueen. Charlie is the president and CEO of McQueen Financial Advisors, which specializes in consulting and advising financial institutions for long-term success. Charlie regularly leads presentations on various economic and investment topics, and we certainly welcome his insights today. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Perry Adams. Perry brings with him more than 25 years of investment management experience to West Shore Bank, where he serves as our Senior Vice President and Director of Wealth Management. Perry is responsible for overseeing our wealth management services and develops our investment strategy. Look forward to hearing the presentation. Thank you, everybody.
So to kick it off, Matt, why don't you just give us a brief overview of the economy in Western Michigan?
Yeah, there's a lot to the economy of the region that are very intuitive. Certainly, there is a higher reliance on hospitality and tourism industry within the region. We associate the region oftentimes with a lot of pure Michigan imagery, and that pans out in much of the industry that we have supporting business and workforce within the region. However, I think it's also interesting to note somewhat disproportional in healthcare and construction, in large part because of population growth and the demographics of that population growth within the region. And then lastly, and maybe a topic for its own standalone discussion someday, but we tend to look at nations and states and regions as monoliths, but even within the region, you do have distinctive subregions. When you look at the 31 corridor versus the 131 corridor, there is a higher degree of affluence along that 31 corridor that does reflect in the smaller submarkets.
Donna, can you pull up the labor graph? Okay, so you can see here, back in March and April of 2020, you can see how that graph is skewed on the right there. There were 22.3 million jobs lost when COVID hit and the economy shut down. Since then, we've gained back just over 17 million jobs, but COVID ushered in extraordinary complexity from a supply and demand standpoint, from a labor standpoint, and how businesses and people have responded to COVID, the restrictions and the policies. It's unprecedented, and it continues today. The Fed recently issued their beige book, and it showed how labor shortages are constraining businesses' ability to keep up demand, because demand has remained strong throughout the COVID pandemic, and it's also increased our hourly labor costs. And then more recently, the Department of Labor puts out a JOLT report. It's called the Jobs Opening and Labor Turnover Report. So the one that came out in July showed there were 10.9 million job openings available, yet there's this huge labor shortage. And so businesses large and small are struggling to find workers. So Charlie, I mean, what is keeping people from re-entering the workforce? What's keeping them on the sidelines?
Perry, it's a great question. And, we're seeing three things. Now, the first one is a lot of people choose not to go back to work when they're basically getting paid the same amount of money they were getting paid and not having to work. Now, that is diminishing with reduction of payments of the bonus unemployment activity. So we're seeing that take place. The second thing we're seeing is an interesting demand structure, that there's demand everywhere. We had a lot of maybe baby boomers that decided they weren't going to retire, but when the pandemic hit, they decided to retire. And so we have this pull up of what we call a pull up of labor, where everyone's moving up in the structure. And so there's a lot of open spaces at all levels. And so we're really seeing a unique mix up of everything. The third component to us is something we work at McQueen Financial very hard not to have this problem, but there are roughly 3.5 million women have left the workforce, working women have left the workforce to take care of kids. And we as a country have done a very bad job at supporting working families, especially working women. And we've done a terrible job with schools, with a lot of schools closing in the country instead of finding ways and doing other things to help support them. So we're seeing that big component is really comprised of these three components: women that have exited the workforce that hopefully are coming back, and then a lot of baby boomers retiring, then also a difficult environment with government stimulus payments to attract people back to the workforce.
Well, that's interesting in terms of people staying home, or parents staying home, or women staying home. We've seen that daycare has become a serious issue in terms of the ability for families to have a daycare take care of their young ones. Is that driven more from COVID, or is that regulations? Is it a combination thereof?
It started with COVID. How do you hire someone during a pandemic to come into your house to watch your kids? As a single father, that scares the daylights out of me, and I think about that daily. And then it's becomes huge demand. Now you have all these people finally said, okay, I've got to get someone to help at home. There aren't that many people that have historically given that kind of work or been giving that type of job and want to do that. And there's a huge demand, and so there's a misallocation of supply and demand. And then I do think it's just something we, as a country, haven't invested in, and as employers, we haven't invested enough into daycare related to schools and office locations. So I don't know if it's as much of the regulation component as it's just something that hasn't been a priority.
So, Matt, what are you seeing strategies that being employed by local businesses to handle labor shortages and higher labor costs?
Well, there are a couple of things going on at a macro level, and a few other things that I think are more unique to our region. At a macro level, you are seeing greater flexibility but by employers. You are starting to see, and I'm sure Charlie will speak to this, wage inflation that is going on across all industries. Those are very real and present. Specific to this region, though, which really had historically low unemployment prior to COVID, and in many ways, COVID acted just more as an accelerant to some of these structural issues that were just discussed. I think that there has to be greater flexibility with your current workforce, and also looking at non-traditional workforce. And what I mean by that, looking at older workers, looking at past offenders that may be on parole. There are a variety of local strategies, but I think within the region, what Charlie addressed with regards to the baby boomers is a bit of a double hit with us. Michigan in the year 2000 was the 30th oldest state in the nation. It is now the 10th oldest state in the nation. And this region has a disproportionately higher number of older individuals than the rest of the state. Yet it's a growing region overall. So we have an in-migration of older individuals, oftentimes when we're talking about that 31 corridor, more affluent individuals who have a demand for goods and services, but we have a ever dwindling workforce to supply those goods and services. So until we're able to create that balance of appropriate workforce for the growth that we have, it's going to be difficult. And I don't see a future, a plausible future, without essentially being more welcoming to working families, households that have parents within them, that the flexibility there, and adopting older and younger workforce strategies.
Well, right there. I mean, how do we attract younger families and younger talent to this region? I mean, there's some industries that obviously are under a lot of pressure, from COVID. Is it vocational training? Is it retraining? I mean, how longer term does this region go about to attract that talent?
Yeah, certainly there are some short-term fixes and long-term fixes. Charlie pointed to some of the longer-term fixes in that we have to create a better infrastructure for working families. I think as a nation, as a state, and as a region, there has been this slow but steady disconnect from what is the infrastructure that supports working families, and that is our schools. If we look at migration patterns and just from anecdotal evidence that one of the first things that when people look to move to a new job or a new region, if you have school age children, you look at the schools, the health of the schools. So there has to be some greater investment there and recognition. Maybe it should start with. And I also think that specific to this region, there has to be a look at the availability and cost of housing versus the wages that are available within the region. That certainly there are places within the region where this isn't true, but some of the more affluent and desirable areas that are most prime for talent attraction within the region, there is a lag in wages, generally 86.7, I think is the last number I saw, the median within the region versus the state, which is lower than the national median. And then along that 31 corridor specifically, you're seeing housing 120%, 130% above state median average. So there is a significant affordability disconnect within the region that existed even prior to COVID. But again, COVID acted as accelerant, particularly with putting brakes on a new housing supply being built over the last 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get into that in a little bit as well, but that is definitely, the affordability aspect is definitely a deterrent. So Charlie, with COVID and just the overall impact in the labor market in specific industries, there is a reshuffling of the labor market taking place. And I mean, how do you see jobs being redistributed, replaced, or reallocated going forward over the next few years?
It's a great question, and the answer is all three plus one more. And so yes, I'm done. I'll stop it. Dunkin' Donuts just opened up its first digital-only restaurant in Boston, and so you have to order by the app. You can't walk in the door and order, and you order by the app. You pay over the app, and when you walk in the front door, there's nowhere to sit. There's no one to talk to. There's a wall with boxes that you electronically open up with your phone, and you get your order. And they did this for a couple of reasons. And one, you can't find people to work at Dunkin' Donuts in Boston anyways, but they're not going to worry about any problems they've been having in the sitting in the front of the restaurant. They've cut cash out of the equation completely, a thing that sometimes disappears in restaurants. And you just have a few people in the back that don't have to interact with customers, that can wear whatever they want and cook the food, and it works. So to me, I think that's an example of things being replaced. People, as you guys know, are moving to vacation homes, and they're moving permanently to what was their vacation homes, as that's modified people's working ability. I have a number of friends in the Boyne City area that just said, you know what, we're done. Kids are off to school. I can work anywhere. They sold their house in Grand Rapids or Detroit they primarily lived in, and they now live in Boyne City permanently. And so we're seeing this effectively relocation, which is my added one there. We're also seeing redistribution in a lot of ways, like outsourced IT work. And we have 5 open IT positions right now here at McQueen Financial that we can't fill. And so we're using outsourced facilities to fill that in. And I do think we're also reallocated because we are looking at different things, and the labor market, you're taking people from one activity and putting them somewhere else because demand is higher, or people are willing to pay higher prices today. And we're seeing a bit of that in the Detroit area right now, where all GM plants are effectively shut down right now. And so all those employees, they're not laid off yet. They're still paying them because they don't think they'll ever get them back. but all those people are also doing other things now. So there's a lot of unique things happening in the workforce. And so I think everything is getting redistributed, replaced, reallocated, and relocated at the same time.
Yeah, I'm drinking Dunkin' Donut or that right now. But I also saw, I think it was Taco Bell had a prototype all technology where you basically drive under. It was almost like a bank where they shoot the thing down through the chute, you get your order. Yeah, and so it's amazing how the restaurant industry is adapting. But a question for you, Matt: are you seeing the adaptation of technology to replace workers here in the region?
Yeah, again, long before COVID, but I think COVID does act as an accelerant that we were on a trajectory of greater automation. Much of that automation prior to COVID was publicized and seen primarily on the goods side. When we look at manufacturing, Industry 4.0, specifically Michigan as a manufacturing leader, and a lot of key manufacturers within the region, we saw greater adoption of Industry 4.0 practices. But on the service side, as Charlie just mentioned, we are starting to see some of that automation. It is interesting when you use when you look at a Dunkin' Donuts or a McDonald's or something like that, that their ability to greater automate to put in the necessary technology and processes is very different than the Iron Skillet in Mansalona or Bubba's in Traverse City. That when you have the sole proprietorship restaurants, they are going to be slower to move to these automated systems, even if it would be to their advantage and best reflects the current labor needs. So I don't see much of that beyond the larger national chain stores having any near-term effect on the service side within the region. But automation on the goods side within the region has and continues to grow.
All right. Well, last question here on the labor, then we'll move into housing. So, Charlie, do you see the labor market strengthening in the coming months? The federal pandemic assistance expired earlier this month. There may be more coming more with the new tax bill, but that's the $64,000 question. Is the expiration of the federal pandemic, is that going to lead to somewhat larger monthly job gains going forward?
Yeah, so I do think the labor market is going to improve, meaning more people are going to enter back into the workforce right now. A lot of the benefits are being cut, and hopefully they continue to get cut down to more normal levels. And also with schools back in and consistently back in right now, more and more people going back to offices, there's more of a regular schedule, and I think some of the working mothers that have left the workforce will come back into the workforce. So I think it is going to improve. But the hard part is the cost is going to be very detrimental, and we're definitely seeing some extremely high numbers in especially some of the restaurants and service industries right now, numbers that are just surprising me in the mid-20s, $25, $27 an hour to get people in right now, which is going to be very, very detrimental for a lot of small businesses. So I do think it's going to get better. It's going to be a while, though, to get through this boost of costs before it comes back down.
Yeah, we'll get back to that in a little bit.
Yep.
So, Don, if you want to pull up the housing side, we'll transition into that. And you can just see how this is all intertwined because of the supply and demand imbalance with the labor and the housing and inflation. But if you look at this housing graph, since October of last year, October of 20, year over year monthly price gains have been in the low double digits. So last October, I think it was 10.4% here last month over the last 12 months, and that's through July, 18.8%. Michigan's up like 17.4% on average. Those are significant price gains. And that's why you can see why people are somewhat concerned about the housing market. And as Matt alluded to, even before COVID, there was a supply and demand imbalance on the housing side. There was a lack of construction. There was huge demand, not much inventory. And then COVID just put it on steroids. And earlier we were talking about how back before the Great Recession, there were pockets of speculation, like in Florida, Nevada, and California, and Texas, where there were sealed bids. Now that seems pervasive across the whole U.S. I mean, Traverse City, Ludington, everywhere. It just a house goes on the market, and then there's a ton of bids. So I guess the question for you, Charlie, is this a housing bubble?
So the answer is no. And I do want to go back and go back. Matt made a really good comment earlier when you were talking about how to attract people to come and work. And there's a lot of housing shortages. And one of the things I'd love to see somewhere in Ludington is build neighborhoods of affordable homes. And you will get people to move. It's like the old adage of build it and people will come. I think that's one of the things, if you could do in your neighborhood, you would get a whole bunch of people moving there because people want affordable housing, and it doesn't matter as much where they used to live. And you guys have a phenomenal part of the world you live in. There's a lot of great benefits. But we're not in a bubble, and I do think we're probably fully priced. Don't get me wrong. I think things are very expensive and to a degree a bit silly. People don't own 5 or 6 homes and they're trying to flip them. It's people buying homes to live in. And when you have the raw demand, it's not a bubble. And we also have to remember here, when you tie in the price of labor and materials, you cannot build a house that you used to build for $100,000 5 years ago. That is $200,000 or $300,000 today. And so we actually have to see the replacement cost is so much higher that it's going to bring everything up. Now, I do think there's a huge affordability problem with people able to afford starter homes, which I know we're going to talk about. But to me, I think we're not in a bubble, but I do think that we are very fully priced. And we may see things come down if people decide they don't want to live somewhere and sell and move. But it is definitely a real supply and demand problem that we're having.
Well, you look at existing and new home sales; they're down 5 of the last 6 months, but yet prices keep moving higher. Is that just strictly supply and demand driving that?
Yes, when you look at the number of houses for sale, there just aren't enough houses for the number of people buying. And the comment made earlier about, someone said to me earlier today that 1 or 2 days in the market and houses are gone, even if they hit the market. And so for me, it's just there's not enough homes being built. There's not enough homes available.
So, Matt, 250,000 is the new $125,000 home, kind of Charlie alluded to. So, how is housing affordability impacting our local communities, and what strategies are being employed to create more affordable housing?
Yes, the affordability has always been an issue for this region for a variety of reasons. Certainly, we all know that affordability used to be loosely defined as 2.5 times a gross household income. That's been blown out of the water. I think that what Charlie talked about, we had lots of supply issues going on. Part of that, again, probably a standalone question, but prices around lumber and the availability of construction materials for a long period of time, it's somewhat stabilized now, but was a real issue. A lot of these are macro issues in Michigan, in this region. Another issue that affects affordability is the regulatory environment. That when we look at zoning is done at a township, village, city level. That you have many different submarkets within each community, within each county, pardon me, that in many ways dictates the cost of a home, specifically when you look at things like minimum lot size, minimum square footage, how fast can you work on inspection, things like that, have the tendency to drive up costs in many of the markets within the region.
Yeah, that's a very good point on the zoning aspect of it. So residential housing has definitely benefited from COVID. But now let's look at the reverse side of that. When you look at the commercial property owners and rental property owners, they've suffered from the structural shift of working remotely and then forbearance initiatives and policies limiting evictions. As these unwind, Charlie, how do you see this playing out on the commercial real estate front?
It's going to be exciting. I think that's how it's going to play out. It's not going to be boring. Every time I think about real estate, I go back to the three words: location, location, location. And I do think there's going to be some structural changes. There's some activities happening here with what do I need for a commercial location? What am I manufacturing? I think there's going to be some areas that do quite well. And I think that we're going to see a slowdown in the forbearances, and I think we're going to see some places really struggle. There's a lot of strip mall-based businesses, I think, that are going to struggle quite a bit for lack of supply and demand, or lack of supply with all the supply chain problems, and they won't have the ability to make enough money to pay rent. And I think that's going to be relative to just not getting the products. So I think there's going to be some really tough situations, and I think you have to be very careful with commercial real estate right now with such big changes in the background with COVID.
And Matt, I mean, what are you seeing here locally for commercial building owners? How are they adapting to this working remotely? And it seems like there's a fair amount of vacant commercial space in our region. What strategies are they employing to increase occupancy? Are they altering their contracts or their lease agreements? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is dependent on what is the reality of remote work long term. I'm not as bullish on it as many others are. I think that it is here. It's here to stay. I think it's a supplement, though, for most businesses, most industries. I think that when you look at our core cities within the region, that they are softer now, but you will see that to start to uptick some. I would be more concerned around, and I use this term loosely within our region, but when you start thinking about, and Charlie mentioned it, the strip malls. So first, what I'll refer to as first ring, second ring suburb areas, I wouldn't be as bullish as in commercial activity for those places. But overall, people are going to seek within our region, our communities, like a Ludington, like a Traverse City, like a Petoskey, and businesses will follow that seeking of place because there is that in-migration of people. For the smaller villages and cities, it's still absolutely critical that we look at broadband as necessary infrastructure that supports both real and potential businesses within those communities and any type of hope to attract those remote workers that are part of that workforce.
Yeah, that's a good point on the broadband and the infrastructure aspect of it. One last question here, Charlie, for you on the housing front, and it's really just to compare and contrast to what went on with the Great Recession right now. You look at 2005, the Fed started raising rates, and that really is what started to unfold the financial crisis. But the first shot across the bow was that hedge fund Bear Stearns. I think it was February 2007 was under some pressure, and so right now you have this Evergrande, this Chinese real estate fund under pressure. This doesn't look like it's going to be a Lehman event. It's going to be confined to China itself. But compare and contrast the fundamentals between then and now with the housing market now.
It's a great question, and as I'm thinking of my takeaways from this presentation, there's a couple things, and Matt talked about affordable housing in your region, and then bringing in broadband internet is absolutely so important. I was at a friend's house in Boyne City, Michigan the other day. They have better internet there than we have in our office in Detroit. Just want to put it there with the co-op. It was just amazing. And that's what is going to be a differentiator is, again, good housing, good internet. Now, going back and comparing and contrasting the housing market and the bubble in the housing market today, your actual question there, Perry. So now getting back to what you've asked. Back in the bubble, I'll never forget a friend of mine was in an elevator with the bellhop with a bunch of luggage going up to a room in Miami, and the bellhop was pointing out in the distance to these are all the condos that I own apartments in that I'm renting to people. And I'll never forget, he called me, and this was like the day before the world fell apart. And he said, I couldn't believe this. These are all expensive, very expensive apartments this bellhop owned. And I looked at that and said, there's so much speculation. And today it's not speculation. And that is what the most differentiating factor is. Today it's people wanting to live in areas where I'm not using a closet as an office to do video calls. And I'm not sitting in the bathroom to take a conference call because it's the only quiet spot in the house. And plus, people have been in their homes for, on average, close to 20 years. Or I'm sorry, 25% of the population in the country have been in their homes now over 20 years. It's an all-time record high. So if you think about that, people have wanted to move since the Great Recession here back in '08, but they haven't been able to. Their homes are underwater. Their homes start to come above water. We then have a pandemic, and there's a lot of pent-up demand to move and do different things. And if I can't go on vacation, I want a pool in my backyard. And there's a lot of components that are really modifying what people look for in a home. And with that, the last comment I want to make is family recreational activities are so much more important today. And that's one of the things Ludington and all the areas the bank works in are amazing areas where I expect to see population growth because people want to be in areas where they have the outdoor activities to do, they have family things to do. And so you comprise your location with affordable housing and fast internet, it's going to be, I think, it could boom quite a bit.
I think the other big difference too are underwriting standards. We basically there were none back then, and now it's much more stringent, that process. So let's move into inflation, Donna, if you could pull that graph up. So this has been front and center for quite some time. You can see inflation rates have shot up here, up 5.2%. That's through August year over year. The headline and core up 4.0%. Again, the supply and demand, if you look at the labor shortage, there's, shortages, logistics, shipping, raw materials. There's just a plethora of things that are impacting the supply and demand imbalance and driving inflation higher. The Fed believes inflation is going to be transitory. My question is, how long is considered transitory? So Charlie, I guess, has the inflation train left the station?
So I'm going to answer this carefully because there is inflation and there is transitory inflation. So the answer is there's both. And looking at that chart, one of the things I look very carefully at is the consumer price index X food and energy. And the reason being food, a lot of the cost of food is transportation, and energy prices, we've self-inflicted gunshots to ourselves on that, which is painful. But when I take food and energy out, we're running about, this last read was around 4%. Big number. Now, last year we were at 1% on food and energy increases. So I put the two together, that's 5, you divide by 2.5%. So we're, in my mind, running closer to 2.5% when you look at inflation over a couple years. Now, it's growing, so let me answer that carefully. Is there wage-based inflation? Absolutely. And you can't cut back wage-based inflation. No one wants their pay cut because there's less inflation next year. That just doesn't happen. And when wages go up, costs of goods that take a lot of labor go up, such as making a taco at Taco Bell to building a house. That's very labor intensive. And so those things come up. And so we are seeing definitely wage-based inflation, which results in some inflation in prices in different areas. But there is also some transitory inflation. What is transitory inflation? What does that mean? That means inflation that's here for a short period of time that then goes away. We have this massive chip shortage, which is causing used car prices to go up. One of the biggest components of the consumer price index going up is used car prices. And they're going up because you can't buy a car right now. I said earlier, GM's not making any cars right now. And so once the chips are all here, that is going to be fixed. It's just going to take some time to get there. And so we have things as shipping costs. Shipping costs are absolutely skyrocketed. Those will get fixed because people will either build boats or will get the problems fixed and the price will go down because more people will get into the business over time. So the answer is yes, we are seeing definitely inflation more than I like, and I think wage-based inflation does lead to more inflation. It takes a little bit of time, but there is some stuff like car prices that won't continue to go up at a 40% clip effectively.
Yeah, the Fed has been, I think, the last 3 times that they issued their dot plot, they've actually upped their inflation projections, kind of behind the 8 ball. So I'll be curious to see today if they up the PCE inflation reading even higher. But Matt, consumer and producer prices have risen sharply. And you look at surveys like Small Business Survey or Consumer Confidence, inflation is a serious concern. In the Small Business Survey, the most recent one showed that 49% of small businesses are raising their prices. It's the highest level since 1981. What are you hearing from small business owners? Are they passing on prices to their consumers? How are they dealing with higher input costs and labor costs?
Yeah, I think that we all know at the end of the day, there's only so much wiggle room in your bottom line before you do pass along prices. So at a macro level, previously when we were talking about tariffs, that affects the consumers. When we're talking about paying restaurant worker $20 an hour, that affects the price of a burger. So no question that those price increases are being passed along to the consumer. I think the other thing on some of this that will likely be transitory and affects our region as a place that has so much recreational opportunity and placemaking associated with it, is that last year during the COVID was the first time in many years where consumers spent more on goods than services. And it's likely to flip back, and I think that will normalize things to an extent. But it is an interesting piece to the whole COVID puzzle, and I believe yet another reason why it's impossible to decouple COVID and the economy right now. That everything that we're talking about lives or dies, if you will, of where we end up with regard to COVID. And it is an unusual place because not for a very long time has the economy been so directly linked to public health.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Charlie, the supply and demand imbalance, it's been here. Some say it's definitely, getting worse. But one thing I've read a lot about is how retail sales and a lot of demand has been front loaded. Do you see the surge in demand lessening over the next year or so?
Barry, I've heard those conversations about front loading of demand, and I think carefully about it, and then I went to Target and Walmart the other day. I have a 7-year-old daughter and wanted to go get a birthday present, and the toy shelves are empty. There's nothing to be found. Try to buy a bicycle right now. Think of these things. So I just don't. I think there was some demand pulled ahead. Like, gee, I'm locked down a year ago, and I want a bike to go and do things. That I think that happens. But now I don't see it being front loaded at this point. I just see there's just a lack of supply of activities, which is going to cause there to be more demand as we go forward. So I'm actually nervous about empty shelves for Christmas and a lot of retailers having a struggle for Christmas sales because they just don't have enough stuff.
Well, that's a great point. I think everybody on this call has gone out and tried to get something. You need a part or whatever, and you go to the store and it's just not there. And I see that Costco's warning again about being able to buy toilet paper. So we may be going through that again. So the the other question I have for you, Charlie, is, I was reading through a FactSet earnings insight report, and they were saying how in the last earnings cycle for the second quarter that 244 companies mentioned inflation as being a headwind. I mean, do you see margins coming under pressure going forward? Is that going to be more pervasive and impact earnings?
Yeah, I think as Matt mentioned a minute ago, the amount of small businesses raising prices, and it's all businesses are going to be raising prices. We talk about how lunch used to cost $8 or $10. It's now $14 or $16. And I think it's definitely going to impact everyone. It's very difficult to raise prices as fast as we're seeing labor costs go up. Business group I'm involved in, we sat around a table and talked about this. The lowest level of cost increase for employment was 10% out of the group, and the highest was close to 30%. And that's over the past 12 months. And so you can't raise your prices on goods, especially if you don't have the goods to sell. And so it's that combination there, the supply chain problem along with higher labor costs are definitely causing some problems. So I see earnings being difficult this next year.
Okay. And so do you think the Fed is going to be backed into a corner and be forced to raise rates quicker than expected?
So I don't think they're going to raise rates very quickly. There's a lot of things they have to do before they get to raising rates. They have to actually start tapering, and they have to complete tapering. You can't raise rates while you're still buying assets. It's doing both sides of the puzzle, and you're just going to cause problems. So they need to start tapering, stop buying assets, change their viewpoint that rates are going to go up. When we went and started the pandemic, we predicted a 5-year low interest rate environment, and we're 2 years into it, we'll call it today. So I think we have another 2 to 3 years of low interest rates. Now, it doesn't mean rates can't drift up 20, 30, 40 basis points or 0.5%. But I think that we're in this low environment for a period of time. And you have to remember, it's not just, the Fed has to be careful about what's happening in the U.S., but they also need to be cognizant of the rest of the world and the vaccine rollout, which, going back to Matt's point, we always have to bring COVID into everything, unfortunately, right now. With the slower vaccine rollout in the rest of the world, we're definitely going to continue to see things a little bit goofy, supply chain problems, and the Fed's going to probably take longer than what most people think to raise rates.
Okay. Well, let's move into the Q&A session. Sid, you want to
Thanks,
take us
Barry.
into that?
Appreciate that. This is Sid Van Slyke. I'm the market leader for West Shore Bank in Traverse City, and we do have some questions in the Q&A I'll go through. The first one, I think from a really high level, we'll go with Charlie. When do you see the Fed beginning to taper back on bond purchases and raising the short-term rates? You just commented on it, so we'll tag on. When do you see that occurring?
I'm hoping we see them tapering end of this year. And that's what I think is correct, but I don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be the first quarter or first half of next year that they start the tapering. They've got a lot of battles to fight with activities, with the free spending of money, but my goal would be end of this year, but plan on next year.
And Matt, there's a question here that I think fits your impression well. If monthly job gains do materialize over the coming months, do you feel this will lessen the hourly wage pressures?
It similar to housing, I think that it has the potential to plateau, and we're seeing a little bit of that right now. But there's just not a magic bullet to this. And specific to our region, which is, again, an older region, there is a disproportionate demand for goods and services, and a disproportionate lower number of those who can provide those goods and services. So there's some real structural issues that are occurring in this region. Some of those are typical of other rural regions, and some of those are atypical in the sense that most other rural regions aren't growing. But Northwest Lower Michigan is growing. So it is a little bit of a unicorn in that discussion.
Okay, and then I have a question here that I'm going to pull both you guys in on this one because I think there is a national level that I'd like Charlie's take on and a more localized by Matt. So, with the population growth in the U.S. at near zero, what are the demographic trends that are pushing demand upward for housing? Understanding that Western and Northern Michigan has seen population growth, but certainly not the state of Michigan as a whole. So maybe Charlie, you could comment on when the population isn't growing, how in the world are housing prices just continuing to push nationally?
Okay, well, that's a great question. There's about 3 points here. And first one, in the Great Recession, a whole bunch of multi-generations moved in with each other. And so we ended up seeing that there should have been a lot of homes built from 2009 through 14 that weren't, because multiple generations were living in single houses and kids were moving back into houses and basements. The joke a friend of mine said is, I'm selling my house because it has a basement. I want a house without a basement so my kids can't move back. And so I think we have that where people are moving out. Now, we do have some population growth. We have roughly 350 million people in the country. Historically, we've had about a 1% population growth. It is a little bit lower than that now, but 1% would be 3.5 million people plus immigration. And arguably, there's maybe 1 million, 2 million people a year. The immigration numbers have been very difficult to understand. So we're talking about maybe 4.5 million new people coming into the country every year between births and immigration. And so we are having a demand, but I think it's primarily here. You've got your first component, which is people moving out of multi-generational homes. Second component is the growth that we have in the country. And then the third component is going to be, do you want to live in a high-rise apartment in Chicago? We could beat up Chicago right now because they're having some tough days in the news. Do you want to live in a high-rise apartment in Chicago and ride in an elevator every day with a whole bunch of people you don't know during a pandemic? The answer is no. And so we're actually seeing some fairly significant shifts of people from cities to more rural areas. And that's going to make some of this change of where the housing stock is. Matt?
Well, forgive me, Matt. I'm gonna stick with Charlie for a minute because we have another question. And since you mentioned the immigration issue, there's another question in there on staffing. Could easier immigration help? And what do you see as blocking forces to that?
This is such a politically loaded question. I love it. There's no way to answer this correctly. I am for good immigration, which means I like people that actually want to work and get a Social Security number and pay taxes and be part of the community. I think we should have lots of immigration. The country's founded on that, and I think it's the right thing to do. So with that in place, I think that would help with staffing activities. I think the visa programs are unbelievably painful. In our region, the Grand Hotel, one of the ways they get all the workers is you bring people into the country with special visas. Those visas are super hard to get right now. So there's a lot of things we could do as a country to improve that and help with staffing. And I do think a good immigration policy is something that we've missed for a number of decades.
Well, I appreciate that. And Matt, I'll bounce back to you on the prior question. With the lack of any major population growth in Michigan, we've certainly seen some in Northern Michigan, and maybe you could comment on that.
Yeah, so Michigan, somewhat famously now since year 2000, Michigan was the only state from 2000 2010 that actually lost a population. We have stagnant growth from 2010 to 2020. However, during both those census periods, this region has continued to see population growth. The dynamics of that population growth, though, are not traditional in that it's not through births, that it is an in-migration of individuals, generally older, generally of retirement age, and generally of greater affluence. How that affects our housing right now really is in a couple different ways. One, what type of housing are they seeking? And is that the type of housing that if there's interest in aging in place, that can sustain them in later years? So if you are 65 years old and building a 4,000 square foot house in the middle of Leelanau County, let's say, is that the same infrastructure? Is that the same need that you're going to need when you're 85 years old? the answer is likely not, that you're going to want to be closer to healthcare. You're likely going to be looking for a home that has greater mobility infrastructure within it. So that's some of the fundamentals that I'm a little concerned about when we look at our region that may not be as sustainable as we think. And then specific to that population, because it is largely an in-migration, how does that transfer of wealth work? Meaning that if you are from a community, we already picked on Chicago, we'll continue with that. If you're coming from Chicago, there's not that structural connection to this region. So when you look at the transfer of wealth, are your kids as interested in being a resident of this region? And there's a lot of question marks there. We don't know. I think a lot of our region, a lot of our future economic health will be based on those demographics, though. And specifically that older population, and what does that mean now? Because today in the region, there are more deaths than births within the region. And 20 years from now, when we look at that wealth transfer and the shift in housing needs.
Well, and Matt, I'm going to stick with you for this next question because this is something I know both you and I in this community have worked on projects together for this issue. And I know we're both very recent users of the service. Given the lack of childcare within the state and our region, coupled with labor shortage, do you anticipate more employers adopting work from home policies to attract and retain talent? And maybe you could also comment on just maybe some of the more creative solutions you've seen in our region for that challenge.
Yeah, so I think first it's important to delineate childcare. Childcare, in this discussion, I think needs to be broken down into two parts. Is that our education system is first and foremost an education system, but does provide a childcare role for working families, and consistency and reliability within that education and care is absolutely critical for working families. And then the daycare piece, the traditional daycare piece, we'll call it 6 months to 6 years. We have seen a decline over the years of daycare infrastructure within our region. And once again, COVID acted as an accelerant, and we saw even greater decline, even though demand has gone up for daycare. Much of that has been due to in-home providers, not what I'll call institutional providers. So meaning the semi-retired a woman down the block who brings in 5 or 6 kids at a time. There's a lot of reasons for the decline in that in-home care. One of those, again, the aging workforce is absolutely there. And then the other one that is of note is the regulatory environment for daycare is absolutely a burden to do business. That there is not much with regard to financial incentives to open a daycare business from the regulatory side and on the margin side. So it is a real problem, and within the region, what you're seeing is greater flexibility by employers. Maybe that someone doesn't come in till 9 and they leave at 4. That hour flexibility is there, and we're seeing even more what I'll say progressive type of strategies where we're seeing employers actually opening up daycare or sharing with a neighbor business or a cluster business on some of daycare activities, because daycare, childcare are absolutely critical for the retention and attraction of working families. Like I said, you can't decouple the economy and COVID. You can't decouple the health and happiness of one's family and their ability to be a productive worker either.
I appreciate that. And now we're going to back it out a little more nationally. And Charlie, I'm going to give you sort of a two-part question here and also let our audience know that this is kind of last call for questions. So if you want to throw anything else in there while I chat with Charlie, this will be your last opportunity. Charlie, with the fiscal packages being considered currently, do you think some form of federal assistance is here to stay, at least for the foreseeable future, similar to the recent pandemic assistance we've seen?
So I hate the question because it's a difficult one, but it's because it's against a lot of things I believe in. You know, we're going to make fun of Chicago one more time. The mayor came out and wants to give $500 a month to people. That's the basic income program that they're trying to work on there. We're seeing a lot of these programs stick around, and more cradle to grave assistance programs are coming along. I think there's a lot of soul searching people should have on thinking about these packages that are coming up, and the results of what we've seen in Europe, for example. And this is very similar to a lot of the activities done there. So I unfortunately think there's more of this coming, but hopefully it won't be as bad as I fear. But I do think there's going to be some sort of continued assistance, needed or not, given the COVID environment we're in and the political environment we're in.
Thank you for that. And what do you see as the main risks to the U.S. economy next year?
So to me, the main risks are supply and demand, number one, and able to get materials. We need, when we talk about infrastructure bills, what we need to do is have more ports in this country, and we have to have ports that don't have quotas of the number of things that can be moved in a day in a labor contract. And so we have some limiting factors of getting things in and out of the country. There's also some difficult things with some of the rules on the amount of pollution from semi-trailers. So when a good comes into a port in California, one semi-truck type drives it to Nevada, which they park it, and another type of semi-truck drives it from Nevada across the country, because the emission standards in California does not make it reasonable to drive a semi from California except in California. So we've definitely have some struggles with some of the ports and the port-based issues that are going to continue to cause supply and demand issues. So I think that's number one. Number two is going to be labor. Unless we kind of figure out some of the labor issues, we'll see prices go up so high that you'll actually start to see, unfortunately, a lot of the goods and services that the lower end of the economic ladder are going to get hampered with. You know, the cost of a McDonald's Happy Meal is doubling effectively over the last few years. We're going to see that a lot of the things bought, food, is going up substantially, and gas prices continue to go up. That's going to be very difficult on the basic level, the beginning level of the economics ladder. And so I'm a little worried about that slowing the economy. So it's people and getting goods and services in place. And along with that, it will add the computer chip shortage is real, and it is a big problem. And Intel's mentioning they don't think it's going to be fixed till 2023. And so that's definitely going to hamper the economy also.
And I hate to put you under a time crunch, Charlie, but there was another question that came in that I think is in your wheelhouse, and we want to respect everyone's schedule today. But with stimulus continuing to come in at a $600 for childhood tax credit and potentially other stimulus down the road, financial institutions are seeing pressure on their capital ratios. What are your recommendations to combat surging asset numbers?
That's a very tough question, and each kid you get either $250 or $300 a month. Right now, it's $18 billion a month that is going into the system from the federal government for kids. And I think as what you do is accept the money and be okay with lower capital ratios, focus on earnings and structure, look for other types of capital, because our local customers have this money that's being given to them by the federal government. They're not spending it as fast as they're getting it. So I think the right thing for us to do is to actually take it and do the best we can to grow capital and take the asset growth. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a lot of difficult things. But I'd like to do that and take care of our local customers. That's what's most important.
Thanks so much to Matt and Charlie, and thank you to our audience for the questions. Great questions today, and I will hand this show back to Perry.
Yeah, Charlie, Matt, thank you so much for joining us today and your insights, and thank everyone for joining us for this discussion. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. My number is 231-346-1516, and my email is perrya@westshorebank.com. And I'll just close by saying the key to uncertainty is discipline. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.